All right, so we're going to go through Form 310. So again, you can access this a couple of different ways. You can get to it through DocuSign. If you do have everything set up with zip forms, you can also go through SC Realtors. You go through screaltors.org/forms. This again gives you the quickest access to a library without having, now it's not editable or anything like that. They're just blank PDFs, but it gives you the access to all of them in here. So we are going to go through Form 310, which is our residential agreement to buy and sell real estate. So everybody good with that? Give a thumbs up from everyone. Make sure everyone's paying attention. Okay, that's good. All right, so here we go. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through it line by line, and I'm going to talk to you about it the same way that I would talk to clients about it. And this is kind of to help you with the script. I found that the purchase and sale agreement, the listing agreement, and the buyer agency agreement are quite, frankly, in my opinion, probably some of the strongest outlines for any sort of buyer or seller presentation or client presentation, because they tell them everything they need to know about the transaction. And also understanding, we talked about this at in the launch week last week, is your clients are about to engage in one of the highest financial risks in their eyes than they probably ever have in buying a house. So the more you know about this and the more you can comfortably explain it to them, the better the experience is for them for the whole process. So just keep in mind. All right, so section 1 is basically the description of the parties of the contract. This is basically the buyer and the seller. In here, you're going to put the buyer's full name, however they want it on the deed. It doesn't matter at this point. The contract's between a buyer and a seller. The buyer can then deed the property however they like. We'll talk about that when we get to that part of the paragraph. What you want to make sure, though, is under the seller side of things, is if you're, and 90% of the time today, I'll be talking about the contract from the buyer's perspective and from your perspective as the buyer's agent. So from the buyer's agent perspective, you want to have the most accurate description of the seller in the contract, because anytime the contract is incorrect and needs to be corrected, it's technically not a valid contract. So if you have let's say, I'm buying a house from Kristen and Connor, and I only put Kristen's name on there and Connor's not on there, it's technically not a valid contract because it's just Kristen. So if we have to then send that back to correct it, now you've got an open-ended contract and you want to have a ratified contract at any given time. So here's the first question that I'll throw out to the crowd. If I'm the buyer's agent and I'm going to be putting an offer on this property, what is the best way I can get the information from or regarding the seller as far as what should go on the contract? What's the best way to do that?
By looking at the CRS tax info on MLS.
Okay, that's a good one. Go to the tax info. What else?
Ask the listing agent.
Ask the listing agent. That's always a good one. Ask the listing agent. It's always a great place to start. Or to go. I would say confirm with the listing agent. Right. I love the listing agent part of it because, again, anytime a negotiation starts, the better the relationship you have, the better chance you have of actually having a successful negotiation. Best case scenario, you pull the deed. Right. Pull the deed on the property. You'll have exactly who owns the property, the verbiage that should be on there. Are you going to do that every time? Probably not. So, between Evan and Devin, I would say you're doing pretty well by going to the tax records and then confirming with the listing agent. Okay. All right. So now let's jump on to moving down this. A couple of things that are important about this. Again, I know it sounds granular. That's the point. That's not my job in contracts. So the more we know about it, the better. So we have a couple definitions for the contract here. The first one is party. I do spend some time on this because party is defined as the buyer or the seller. Party is defined as both buyer and seller. Who is not on there listed as a party to the contract? Us. Exactly. We are not party to the contract. Where areas that creeps up, commission, right? I get this all the time. I'm working with Devin. She's my best friend's daughter that's moved in from out of town, and instead of paying a referral fee, I'm going to reduce my commission, or I'm going to rebate that commission back to her closing. That would not go in the contract. The commission is between me and the listing agent. The commission has nothing to do with the buyers or the sellers on the property, or as it relates to parties to the property. So just keep that in mind. Brokers, this is one too that shows up a couple different times. These are the licensed South Carolina brokers in charge, their associated licensees, and their subagents. The subagents one honestly is a moot point now because we don't have subagents anymore. However, associated real estate licensees, what this says to me is that anywhere it asks for a broker signature, that does include you as an associated licensee. So when you look at releases, buyer's agency agreements where it says broker sign, you can sign as the licensee on there. Now, a couple of times this will turn up where the other side might push back would be a release of agreement, especially if there's earnest money involved or there may be some sort of dispute. The other side may come back to you and say, you know, Scott, I appreciate that you signed this, but my broker is requesting that your broker sign this. We're broker it. Don't die on that hill to argue whether or not you can sign it or I can sign it. Drop it in a DocuSign, send it to me to sign. I don't have a problem with that. But just know most of the time you don't need to have my signature on there. Now, this only relates to South Carolina contracts. If you've got a referral form or something that comes in that says, hey, receiving broker, you'll more than likely need to have my signature on there. Closing attorney is the attorney that's selected by the buyer to coordinate the transaction and the closing. This is where you would select who the closing attorney is going to be. If this is left blank, that does not change the status of the contract. This does not have to be filled out for the contract to be valid and enforceable. So if you do have a buyer that is looking to purchase and they do not have their closing attorney selected yet, you do not have to, that's not something that I would wait for. I'd go ahead and try to get the contract ratified. Also understand that the closing attorney, absolutely.
Sorry. If you don't have to fill it out in order to submit the offer or for the contract to be ratified, and then obviously they're going to need one at some point, so they'll get one. Do we have to edit this contract then and add it?
No, you don't. And honestly, I would argue that by doing so, you kind of could open up the contract to having big changed. And so if you did add anything to it, you'd have to have both sides initial it. It's the unilateral decision. It says in there it's unilateral, it's selected by the buyer. I would not worry about going back and filling it out. It's
Okay,
yeah, absolutely. Great question. Also keep in mind that the closing attorney can, but does not have to represent the seller as well. So again, same scenario. I've got Devin as a buyer. She comes in, she selects Butler and College. Evan tells me, hey, as the seller, we actually would prefer Weeks and Irvine to represent us separately. That's fine. They can have separate representation. As a listing agent and as the broker in charge, I would recommend that you recommend to your seller they have separate representation, just in case anything goes wrong. It's typically not much more of a fee. The challenge is in Charleston is we have a lot of very good, reputable, larger law firms. So the chances are is 90% of the time it's going to come down to one of the big five. So sometimes they may not have a choice because the seller wants Weeks in Irvine and the buyer wants Weeks in Irvine. Okay, well, if they're both comfortable with that, that's their decision. Effective date, this is the final date upon which any party to negotiation places the final and required signatures and or initials and dates on this contract, and delivers notice to initially cause this primary contract to be binding to all parties. So again, it's not just the ratification date of the contract. It starts there, right? Devin submits an offer, Evan accepts it. I send notification back to Devin as the agent saying, hey, your offer's been accepted. Then we have that's the effective date for that. Should we get any time frames such as, there's really not a lot more time frames that show up in the contract anymore. CO 100 effective date would be when you submit it, right? You submitted the CO 100, the buyer, then the seller can then respond to it. That's the effective date for that. Again, really the primary effective date is going to be the date of ratification. Good funds. This applies to a couple different areas. This is the transfer, vague, a required amount of US dollars within any required time frame. Okay, so three main areas where good funds show up. Number one, first and foremost, the purchase, right? You've got the purchase price on the closing date. They've agreed to buy the house for $350,000. Got to transfer the $350,000 from buyer to seller. Second place would be the earnest money. That's the transfer of good funds during the timeline that is desired, which we'll go through. Again, earnest money is not required, but that's what it means by good funds. And then the third one is the termination agreement. Termination is our good funds, or termination fee is a good fund deposit or transfer from the buyer to the seller in order to terminate. It's not a check, it's not cash, it's not a wire, it's a transfer of good funds. When we get to termination fee, it'll make more sense why I'm being so specific on that. Just keep in mind though, it's the transfer of money. And then time, all time stated to be in South Carolina Eastern Time in the contract, so there is no misunderstanding on that. Time is of the essence with respect to all provisions of the contract, meaning time is the essence is basically another way of saying legally, there's a reason there's a deadline here. If you don't meet the deadline, you're in default of the contract. Okay. Question so far, we're almost through section 1. Exciting stuff, isn't it? I can see it in your faces.
So I do have a question
All
about
right.
broker signature. And I didn't know that, that we are able to sign under after you have the buyer and seller sign and it says broker signature, we're able to sign that.
Yes.
Oh, okay. I never knew that.
Yes. Yep. Some people may argue that. Again, anything that you're signing after this is in relation to this. So if it's a termination, if it's an addendum, if it's anything like that that requires a broker signature, that's already been defined in this first part of the contract, that includes you as an affiliated licensee. So again, not the hill to die on if somebody pushes back. If somebody really wants the broker signature, that's fine. When we held earnest money, I was a little more strict on that. For release of earnest money, I wouldn't do it without the signature broker, without the broker signature. Again, now it is what it is. Okay, so moving on to the next part. So we get into talking about agency. Again, it's discussing agency, it's discussing representation, but is not bringing any of the agents into as parties to the contract. So this first part is where really the only place written in the contract where you disclose whether or not the buyer and seller is a South Carolina real estate licensee. Again, South Carolina does not mean if again, say Devin's listing her house here, she's an agent in Charlotte, doesn't mean I'm not going to disclose that as a listing as the seller, she's a real estate licensee. However, for the contract, she's technically not a South Carolina real estate licensee. So again, neither one of those would be checked. This next part, we talked about this on Friday for those of you that were in there. This is where the seller or the buyer acknowledging that they've received the disclosure of agency relationships, the brokerage disclosure here in South Carolina. So if you have not given this to the client, this would be a little awkward. You're walking through and say, Tamara, this is acknowledging that I've given you the South Carolina disclosure of brokerage relationship form, and you've decided whether or not you're going to be a client or a customer. If you've never had that discussion with the client at this point in time, this will be a little awkward. So make sure that you have done it, A, to keep it from being awkward, and B, because it's required that you've had done this at first substantial contact. Make sense? Okay. Again, this is where they will review and disclose whether or not they are choosing to be the client or the customer in here. So in the event, by the way, this doesn't often happen, but you may have a time or two where you go through the agency disclosure brochure and it does ask for the buyer or the seller to sign on there. And you will have one at some point in time that just will not want to sign it. They'll just say, Amy, just met you, sounds great, trust you, everything seems nice. However, I'm not ready to sign anything. It's a disclosure document. That's totally fine. It's not like they're signing the agency agreement or anything there. Make a little note on the document that says unwilling to sign, initial it, go off there. They will have to sign it on here though, should they decide to put an offer in on the property. Make sense? All right, section 1's done. How's everybody doing? That's right. Got a couple thumbs up. Well, look at that, I got 5 thumbs up. That's great. I love the enthusiasm. All right, so let's go to section 2, purchase price. Everybody's favorite part. So this is where you talk about the purchase price of the property. You will put the price in here. Now it's going to be payable by transfer of good funds, which we talked about. 3 ways that it's going to be done. Number 1, it's going to be finance. It's going to be a combination of finance and cash, or it's going to be cash. 99% of the time, 95% of the time, it's going to be a combination of financing and cash. Unless they're doing 100% financing or they're paying cash, it's going to be a combination of the two. So just keep in mind on that. Now, if it is a common, go ahead.
Sorry, like would a VA loan qualify as finance exclusive?
No, because they still would have to bring, unless they're getting 100% finance, you would want to disclose that they're having to bring cash as well.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, don't get too bogged down in this yet from a technicality standpoint, unless it's 100% financing. Option 2 would be the one that they choose. Okay. Next part. This part's one that's overlooked quite often, and it's come back to bite us a couple times. And this is the verification of cash available at closing. So this is, they have an option to attach it or not attach it, or to be delivered by a certain date. Okay. Now, this, the most common place would be is if you get a cash offer, right? If I get a cash offer, I'm looking at this from a listing agent. I'm going to go to my seller and say, Scott, we got a cash offer. That's great news. They have not attached, nor do they plan to attach any proof of funds. My professional recommendation would be that we request that they provide. And then you can counter at this point, say, hey, to be delivered before, and choose a date. If I'm the buyer's agent and I'm submitting an offer and it's a cash offer, or it's a highly leveraged finance offer, like, hey, they're only getting 50, they're claiming to put 50% down and getting a 50% loan. I'm going to say, Scott, this is a strong offer, and we're going to want to show proof of funds that we can come to the table with half the price of the home or the full price of the home via cash, and attach it there. Again, it's part of the negotiation. So now, verification of cash, not to get bogged down in the weeds, but they send you some sort of statement that says, hey, here's my verification of cash that shows I've got $200,000 in my Charles Schwab account that I can liquidate. You would then need to make sure if I'm, let's go back to this, I'm representing Devin as the buyer. She sends me this, says, hey, here's proof of cash. I'm going to send that. You do want to say to Devin, please make sure you check with your financial consultant that this money can be pulled out in time and that you're not running any sort of risk between now and closing of the value of this account going down. Because the value of the account going down is not taken into consideration. Can y'all hear the vacuum? Okay, good. Nothing's been happening in the office all day until I jump on a Zoom. So what happens is, and we've seen this happen a couple times, somebody submits an offer October 1, set to close at the end of October, halfway through November, the market takes a crash one weekend. Now that account goes down from 200,000 down to 175. They needed the 200,000. Now they don't have the money. There's no stipulation in the contract that says, well, only if their stocks remain or their retirement account remains at a certain amount. They're still obligated for the purchase. So just something to keep in mind as you are advising buyer clients. All right, and then lastly on this purchase, the first part of, or the last part I should say of section 2 is whether or not the contract is contingent on the closing of a real buyer's property. Up until 6 months ago, we never saw this. Right up until 6 months ago, it was no contingencies, whatever it is. Please, Lord, give me your house. Here's my firstborn. I'll do anything. Now that's changed. This is where they would disclose whether or not it's contingent upon the house, them having a house to sell. Again, there's not a requirement that they have to make it contingent. They can choose for it to be or not to be contingent upon the sale of the buyer's real property. And there's a form that can or cannot accompany based on what the buyers decide. If I'm the listing agent, I'm going to highly advise that if Form 504 is not accompanying this offer, that we counter asking for it to be included. And then you can actually counter with Form 504. Now, not to get bogged down into that, Form 504, and actually I will come back to this if we have time, or we'll do it at another one. Form 504 basically sets out, the stipulations of the house. Okay, so Evan's coming in, he's purchasing this property, he's got a house in Park West to sell. It's going to say the address of the house, whether or not it's on the market, not when it will be on the market, if it's under contract, if not when it'll be under contract, if it's closed or set to close, and if not when it will be set to close. All right, so all of these are listed out with deadlines that would say, okay, it's listed. If it's not under contract by X date, then the seller has these options. The buyer has these options. I normally start the contract class out with this. The game of the contract is not to win the earnest money. The game of the contract is to have a reasonable, valid contract that both the buyer and the seller are happy with closing at closing day. So if someone comes in and says, well, Evan submitted his offer, he didn't really include Form 504, so it basically means he can get out all the way up into closing. It's just contingent on his home selling indefinitely. So if he doesn't sell, he's protected. That's not a win-win. The seller's not expecting that. And if the seller's being advised poorly, that doesn't show up very well for everyone in the end.
I have a question, Joseph. It may
Uh-huh.
sound, but I just want to have clarification purposes because this will be a scenario for me. So my current
Mhm.
home is just in my name, right? So we're
Mhm.
going to be selling this home and we're going to buy another home and the next home will be in my fiance's name. Would this pertain to us? Like, would I have to have the contract contingent upon the sale of this home? I'm going to be listed on the next home as far as like the deed, but not like the loan.
So who's listed on the property doesn't have anything to do with whether or not it's contingent on the home selling. It's whether or not you can purchase the next property
Mhm.
without the home selling. So if you can purchase property 2 without property 1 selling, or let me rephrase that. If you can, or if you want to,
Mhm.
you may not want to. You may
No.
simply say, hey, we can, but we don't want to purchase unless we sell this house.
Correct.
The contingency has nothing, yeah. The contingency has nothing to do with who's on the deed. It's a matter of whether or not you want to purchase the house or can purchase the house without selling your house.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Great question. You're welcome. Sorry. All right. So section 3, property. So this is an important part of the contract. So property describing what's being purchased. So I'm going to read through it. So the property is all right, property. Hereby acknowledge sufficient good contract consideration, meaning mutual promises herein, meaning we've agreed. The seller will sell and convey, and buyer will buy the purchase price and all lot or parcel of land, of pertinent interests, improvements, landscape, systems, and fixtures, if any thereon, and further described below in property, meaning down here, personal property. Seller agrees, important part. Seller agrees to maintain in operable condition the property and any personal property conveying in the same operable condition, including any landscaping, grounds, and any agreed upon repairs or replacements. They will agree to maintain it from the effective date through closing, subject to normal operable wear and tear. Okay, we're gonna pause on that. So basically what this is saying is that the seller says, all right, I'm under contract. And from the point I'm under contract, anything I have agreed to sell, be it the entire house itself, all the way down to I've agreed to give you the toaster oven as well. You are then required to maintain everything you've agreed to sell in operable condition, the same operable condition from now until closing. Here's why this is important in a couple areas where this shows up. Personal property. Let's say you've got a stainless fridge, buyer really wants it, they put it in the contract. Evan says, fine, take the fridge. Don't want the fridge anyway. I'm building a brand new house, get a brand new fridge. It needs to be disclosed if anything is wrong with that fridge. If the fridge doesn't have the ice maker working, or the light doesn't come on, or whatever it may be, you want to make sure before ratifying that the buyer knows that. Because here's what happens. They go through the final walkthrough, somebody's messing around, pushes in the ice machine, ice doesn't come out. Buyer says, I want an ice machine. I asked for this fridge. This fridge needs to be working. It was working when we bought it. Evan says it's never worked. Then all of a sudden you have a difference of opinion. And guess who ends up paying for it? Typically neither the buyer nor the seller. Typically the agent.
Agent.
Yeah, it takes one $2,800 refrigerator to never do that again. Not that that's ever happened to me in the summer of 2016. All right, so
Oh gosh, and don't leave the refrigerator off altogether. Like, oh my gosh, I did that. So yeah, right before Christmas, guess who went? My clients were lenient on me though. I went half. I didn't have to pay for a whole new one. She was like, it's fine, you can just go half because we were gonna get an upgraded one anyway. Oh my God,
okay.
don't talk about refrigerators, okay? Because I promise you that's be the first thing on that contract. I would never forget that again.
PTSD.
Yeah, a little bit. So the other thing, what that does bring up though, and this is an important thing, is goes back to the maintenance of the property. So we did have an issue at one point in time where a similar situation, buyer and seller were supposed to close on the 15th. Seller, huge issue with title based on a probate, and so the closing got pushed 2 weeks. Seller had the property scheduled, the power to be scheduled to be turned off, and didn't change that, so the power went off in the house in July. Right, refrigerator, ice melts, goes down to the floor, nobody's in there, buckles the kitchen floor. Well, now the seller has not maintained the property in operable condition and is responsible for replacing the floor. So again, things to keep in mind in all of this when it comes to maintenance paragraph. Okay, these are the fun one. Second part of this, section 3. Buyer acknowledges the opportunity to inquire about owners association issues, common area issues, condominium master deed issues, assigned parking, storage, members, leases, finance, prior to signing the contract. Leasing issues and other items, finance, equipment, we'll talk about here in a second. Now, here's the deal. We're a due diligence contract now, so this is kind of a moot point. Because in a due diligence, you can basically do any of the research that you want to during due diligence and cancel for any reason whatsoever. However, just to keep in mind that there are things that you can check ahead of time, because if you have a termination fee, regardless of what it is, right? Let's say you, here's where this shows up. Devin writes a contract on a listing. The buyer goes in, it's a $500 termination fee, and then they find out during due diligence that the HOA is completely out of reserves, or something's wrong with the property that could have been checked. There's a lease on the property that's for the solar panels, whatever it may be, and it wasn't disclosed in the seller's disclosure. Well, now you have a disclosure issue. And now you have the buyer saying, well, if I'd known that, I never would have offered to pay a $500 termination fee. I would have never ratified the contract on the house. So any of these things that you start to see, these are parts of the contract. If you see solar panels on there, if it's a condominium association, you want to do as much research as you can prior to going under contract, knowing that if anything like that comes up, the buyer can get out of the contract and they may be responsible for the termination fee. So something to just keep in mind on that. Questions about the description of the property in section 3? All right, the actual property description. So the next part just basically talks about the property description. Goes back to the same question. Best place to get this, go to the tax records, confirm with the listing agent, go to the deed, fill out of this as much as you can. In my opinion, address, city, tax map are the non-negotiables. If you can't get any other information, dash through it, or just, I wouldn't put NA, but if you can't, dash through it or put NA is fine as well. Don't leave anything blank. Okay. Personal property, this is where you'd put in any property that is not a fixture that you want to transfer. Here's what you don't put in here. All appliances convey. What is an appliance? If you look up the definition of appliance, that's anything from a curling iron to a furnace, right? So you do all appliances convey. We know what you mean. You mean the kitchen. You probably mean the washer and dryer, but in writing, that doesn't clarify. Next thing you don't put, everything as seen in the house on January 24th, on the showing of January 24th, or everything as described in the MLS. You want to be specific when you're talking about personal property. GE, model number 251 stainless refrigerator. Washer and dryer, GE model, blah, 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 blah. I know this sounds grueling. I can see it in some of your faces. You're like, man, that seems like overkill. It's overkill right until you write refrigerator, and the seller moves out, takes the stainless refrigerator and puts the white rusty beer fridge from the garage into the kitchen, which is all they were obligated to do, was to transfer a refrigerator. And then lucky Amy gets to go to Lowe's and hopefully find a Black Friday sale on a refrigerator, which, by the way, it never happens when there are sales going on. All right, so B is specific on there. Now, in attachments, you don't really often need to do an attachment, just list it on here. If you're buying a furnished property, then yes, at that point, if you've got a lot of stuff that's going into it, you want to set an attachment on there. Whether or not it's a bill of sale is really up to the lender. You're normally just fine of having it done on a separate piece of, like, you could just do it in a document and have everybody initial. All right, conveyance. Don't worry, I know you're thinking 37 minutes and we're only on page 2. I'm gonna pick it up. Don't panic. I can see it in Scott's face. He's already thinking of something else. All right, so conveyance. So the closing occurs when the seller conveys the property to the buyer and occurs no later than 5 p.m. on or before. For today, we're just going to use February 15th. On or before means it can close on or before, not on and before if the buyer requests it. It's or before if everyone agrees to close sooner. Conveyance shall be free, simple, made subject to all easements, reservations, rights of way, covenants of record, provided they do not make the title unmarketable or adversely affect the use of value of the property, and all government statutes, ordinances, rules, permits, and regulations. Seller agrees to convey marketable title with a properly recorded general warranty deed free from any encumbrances, liens herein stated, and in names. This is where the buyer would put how they want it in the deed. Again, this isn't a required part of the contract. If they don't know, you can leave this blank. The buyer can review with the attorney how they want that in there. Couple important parts on time frame. Don't worry, I'm going to go through and break this paragraph down. The deed shall be delivered to the closing attorney's designated place on or before closing date, no later than 10 a.m. First issue that comes up often. Seller agrees to pay all statutory deed recording fees. Parties agree that the broker shall have access to the closing and relevant documents. Brokers shall be given copies of the settlement statement. Parties agree to hire attorneys. Sellers shall convey possession of the vacant and reasonably clean property, free of debris, along with all keys, codes, and remote controls, available documents, and similar ownership items to buyer at closing. All right, so let's go through the list of ways that this section can cause issues. Number one, closings by 5 p.m. So if the buyer's schedules for closing to be at 9 a.m. and they show up at an 8 o'clock walkthrough and the seller is not moved out, buyer and buyer agent start screaming, "We're in breach of contract, we're in breach of contract." You're not in breach of contract. That seller has until 5 p.m. to have that house clear and close. Okay, so just because we've decided to close earlier, albeit on the same day, but just because we've decided to do that does not necessarily mean that the seller is in breach of contract. Shall be fee simple, made subject to all easements. Big thing here, let's jump down to convey marketable title with a properly recorded general warranty deed free from encumbrances and liens. Here's where this is showing up. Number one, we've got a solar panel system on there that we didn't realize that when we financed it, we put a lien on the property. We get to closing. In order to pay that off, it's $30,000. If I'd known I had to pay the $30,000 off, I wouldn't have been able to close on the property. That's not the buyer's problem. It's also not a reason to get out of the contract. They have to provide a marketable title free from any liens. So that's a big one. The deed shall be delivered to the closing attorney's designated place on or before the closing date, no later than 10 a.m. So we get this very often. We get calls the day before. Seller's attorney hasn't delivered everything. We can't close on time. They're to breach of contract. No, they're not. They've got till 10 a.m. Get all the paperwork and title work to the closing attorney at the time. This one's always fun. Vacant and reasonably clean. I can tell you for a fact that my definition of reasonably clean and Kristen's definition of reasonably clean are substantially different. So when you're walking your client through this, you want to make sure they understand, hey, they're going to clean the property. It's really, a lot of people will say like swept, whatever it may be. If you're really concerned about the cleanliness of the property, then we need to ask them to have it clean. Otherwise, know that you're probably going to have to clean the property. Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I understand you're waiting we've waited to the last minute and you planned very, very poorly. Reasonably clean, free of debris is not a refrigerator full of spoiled food and a garage full of trash. Okay, so just make sure you communicate that to them. You would be surprised, even though that would take less than $100 and a crew to come get and clean that out, all it does is throw emotions up the day of closing for everyone to freak out. So just be careful on that. Also, along with all keys, codes, any remote controls, available documents, and similar ownership items to buyer at closing. This one we see a lot because honestly, show of hands right now, who would know where to go get a front door key to your house right now? Okay, one of you. You're either coming through the garage or you know you leave the one door open or wherever it is, you don't know where all the extra keys are. Again, make sure you set the buyer up for expectation on that. Make sure you ask the listing agent, hey, leave everything you can in the garage. Now, I would start to make sure, hey, do I have my garage door openers? If I've got 3 garage bays and I've only got 1 opener, that's going to be a problem. It doesn't take a lot to get a new garage door opener. So just address that ahead of time. All right, how's everybody doing? Any questions about that one?
Good so far.
Fantastic.
This
Awesome.
was a good refresher. I haven't wrote a contract since November, so I'm on this. Excited
Well,
to
it's
write.
good.
Yeah.
Well, it's good. It's a refresher. It's not good. I'm not writing the contract yet. Hey, you're not alone. All right, earnest money. So this is where you disclose where earnest money will be, how much will be deposited and when. Pop quiz. Is earnest money required for a contract to be valid?
Yes.
I got yes, and I've got 1, 2, 3 no's. I got 2 yeses and 3 no's. The answer is no.
No.
Earnest money is not required. Now, if it is, okay, let me make sure I ask the question clearly. Can it be 0? Yes. Now, if you put it in here and you don't deposit it, then no, it is not a valid contract. So if I didn't ask that clearly, but it's not required to have an amount in here for it to be a valid contract. It can be 0. Okay. So you have the total amount that's going to be deposited. And then it comes in 2 ways. It either accompanies the offer, which 9 times out of 10, that never happens. Unless when Scott wrote the offer, he actually handed me the physical check. I bet he doesn't even have a checkbook. So you want to make sure that you have that in there. Well, actually, Evan probably don't have a checkbook. Scott's probably got one. So you got to make sure that if you're not accompanying the offer, that you're not saying that it is. So it's blank amount accompanies the offer, and then blank amount will be paid by 6 p.m. on this date. 95% of the time, you're going to want to use option 2, but it'll be paid by 6 p.m. on this date. This date should not be any further than 24 hours out. It doesn't need to be really much further than about 24 hours from ratification. It can be the form of check, the option for cash. Please don't do that. And then
Sorry,
other could be.
I have a question. What if
Mhm.
you write this contract on like a Friday night, evening or
Mhm.
something? Could that date be Monday then?
Sure. Yeah, it
Okay.
can be, because you're not going to be, again, 80% of the earnest money is going to be held by attorneys now anyway. So you're not going to be able to get it to the attorney unless you're wiring it directly or anything like that.
The,
Oh, yeah, so
if y'all don't know, the Earnest app is really awesome to use. It's an app. You just put everyone's email addresses in, the attorney's address, email address, and who you want to be sent the receipt, and it just, the buyer fills it out, takes it out of their account, and it's gone to the attorney. It's really easy.
And most attorneys are participating in that now. So it's a very easy way to do it. Gives you a paper trail. All right, so this will be credited to the buyer at closing and dispersed only as authorized, only as parties agree in writing or by court order, or by contract, or by required for closing and closing attorney. Buyer and seller authorize so-and-so. This is typically going to be the closing law firm. Very few real estate companies hold earnest money anymore, as the escrow agent to deposit and hold and disperse earnest money. Broker does not guarantee payment of check or checks accepted as earnest money, meaning, hey, Scott, my buyer gave me this check. I am giving it to you, Devin, as a listing agent. That does not mean I'm guaranteeing that this is good funds. It can bounce. And if it does, it's not my fault, it's Scott. Parties direct the escrow agent to communicate reasonable information confirming the receipt of the earnest money upon the broker's request. So an email will be fine. And if that's all you have, then you can upload that as proof of the earnest money. If the earnest money is not delivered, the seller may terminate the contract by delivery of notice of termination of the buyer. So if you put it in, we'll go back to, let's say, Amy's example, it's going to be Monday at 6 p.m. And at Monday at 6:01, they don't have it. That seller then can terminate, no questions asked. So if Amy receives that notice of termination at 6:01 and the earnest money has not been given, that buyer's out. They do not have cause, a unilateral termination at that point in time. Now, they are not required to terminate. So let's say that happens. Amy doesn't deposit in time. The inspection was done that day, and then something goes wrong with the contract. It's not like it was a voidable contract simply because the seller did not terminate because the earnest money wasn't turned in. It's just an option. All right, this big bold paragraph here basically just is once again disclosing in giant letters that earnest money will not be distributed or dispersed without an agreement between the parties or a court order. So this is where this shows up. Scott comes in, he puts an offer in on the house, he's got $2,000 in earnest money, and the buyer, the seller just absolutely changes their mind 10 days after closing or 5 days before closing. Seller comes back and says, you know what? I met Scott, not a big fan of him, don't want to buy my house, I'm out. It's like a blatant just defaulting on the contract. Scott's clearly going to want to say, give me my money. Well, as clear as that may be, South Carolina law does not allow the earnest money to be disputed or distributed until everyone agrees or a court order says to disperse it. I know that sounds dramatic, yet you'd be surprised how many times in a situation, it's not normally that obvious, but there will be a lot of times, Scott's the buyer or Scott's the seller. Say Scott's the seller and the buyer does their final walkthrough and just says, I don't like the way the sun set, I'm out. That's a clear default in the contract. And I get this question all the time. Well, clearly the buyer will get or the seller get the earnest money, right? Contract protects them. The contract also says, unless it's signed and agreed upon by all parties or a court order, there's no guarantee of earnest money going to anybody. Okay.
And does it typically go to a small claims court? Is that what the next step?
Yeah, there's a couple different ways it's handled. We try to mediate as much as possible. South Carolina does have great mediation services. I'll tell you 90% of the time, if we can't mediate it amongst brokers in the greater Charleston area, at that point, it'll be small claims court. But what happens is, this is a great question. What happens is then it goes back to the attorney holding the earnest money. And you would basically say, hey, I can't, well, you'd select option 4. If anybody's willing to do it, you'd select option 4 on the release that says, hey, we're releasing the contract, but earnest money's in dispute. So attorney, do your thing. Now, if for some reason they're also not releasing the contract, then the attorney at that point would have to, I can't remember, I'm drawing a blank on what it's called, but it's basically forcing them to work it out by either taking each other to a small claims court or getting attorneys involved and telling the attorney how to disperse it. Yep.
Cool.
All right, transaction costs. This is the breakdown of what the transaction costs are. I'm going to go through this one kind of quickly because this could be its own topic. But basically, divide up in the first paragraph here, the first part of this paragraph here, everything that's what's considered a buyer's transaction costs, and what all's included in that. It can include broker compensation, by the way. And then the second part of the paragraph says, here's what's involved as the seller's closing costs. So this is by default. When everybody the closing costs come to the table, here's what you're responsible for unless agreed otherwise in writing. This is where you start to get a little bit tricky in that all costs to obtain information from or pertaining to an owner's association. Private or public transfer fees, costs similar to a transfer fee, either a certificate of assessment, capital contribution, working capital, estoppel fees, are the seller's or buyer's transaction costs. And if they do not check a box, these costs will be added to the seller's transaction costs. This is super important as a listing agent to make sure that you have the seller or you facilitate the seller confirming with their HOA that there are not any transfer fees. Here's where this is starting to show up. People lived in a neighborhood for 15, 20 years. There's never been a transfer fee. They don't pay attention to the HOA documents. They don't pay attention to the HOA meetings. And earlier this year, the HOA voted in a transfer fee of X%. And in negotiations, they didn't care about this because they were like, hey, I like the price. I like everything about it. That's fine. We'll pay for anything. We don't have anything. And then at closing, it shows up, hey, here's a $2,500 transfer fee. Now the seller's responsible for that. You just want to make sure that you are very clear as to who pays, or if there is one, and then who pays for it. Next question always is typically who pays for it. There's never a typical answer. However, from a logical standpoint, if I'm looking at this and saying, hey, if it's a capital contribution, I personally think the buyer should pay for it. They're contributing to the capital account for the neighborhood they're moving into. I'm moving out as the seller. I don't care what they do with their money moving forward as the HOA. Again, it's a negotiated item though. And then the last part of this is this, at closing, you can negotiate if the sellers will pay a transaction cost. This is a dollar amount, not a percentage. So you got to keep that in mind if you start negotiating price. This includes non-allowable costs first and then allowable costs. Buyer is responsible for any buyer transaction costs exceeding this amount. Okay, that's a good one. Here's the other one. If the amount exceeds the actual amount of those costs or amount allowed by the lender, then any excess funds will revert to the seller. This is very important to pay attention to, particularly when you get into low down payment programs, and then they're turning around, they're asking for $10,000, $12,000 and closing costs, which are getting close to 3%, 4%, 5%. A lot of times you will have a lender that will not allow the seller to contribute any more than a certain amount. Let's say Scott's the seller. He's agreed, hey, I'll pay up to 15,000 in closing costs, and the lender only allows 5%, or excuse me, 10,000. That 5,000 would then go back to Scott. He just came into 5,000 extra dollars in this closing. And you cannot, I will repeat, and this will be in the recording, this cannot be paid outside of closing. Buyer can't go to Scott and say, hey, great, why don't you just leave a $5,000 check in the kitchen drawer, because that's what we agreed upon anyway. And a lot of times you'll have the seller say, sure, I agreed to it, whatever it is. Still can't happen. Okay, that money has to revert back. So it's super important if you're representing a buyer that you have a clear understanding of how much they are allowed to accept as closing costs. Make sense? All right. Paragraph or section 7, finance. So the contract either is or is not contingent upon financing. This does not have anything to do with an appraisal. This is only financing. Now they're either getting a 30-year or 15-year or some sort of other program at a reasonable prevailing market rate with an amount to a maximum of blank % of the purchase price. As a listing agent, I'm going to start paying attention here. It says I'm getting a 50% loan, then I'm going to want some verification of funds for the remainder amount. If they're putting 100% loan, I'm going to want to know exactly what that program is to see whether or not this house will qualify for it and whether or not it's realistic to ask for that.
And what do you consider a good time frame for verification of cash? A couple days, a week, a few days?
Yeah, so going, I would say within a couple days. I don't think, if in my personal opinion as a listing agent, if I'm representing you as a seller, I'm gonna say, hey Scott, I don't want to be a hard butt on them. However, if they're ready to purchase a home, they should be ready. If they can't show me where they have the money, they can't show the lender where they have the money. If they can't show the lender where they have the money, how far along are we on this? So I would say less is more on that one. Yep. Financing contingency. Okay, financing contingency expires when? At closing. Very important. You have a financing contingency until closing. That's the one contingency that survives the entire contract. Buyer must make timely good faith efforts to apply for and obtain financing while refraining from contrary actions, meaning don't go buy a Porsche once you get under contract. Buyer shall inform seller and brokers of pertinent financing issues and authorize the buyer's lender to disclose pertinent loan information to the seller and brokers. This is a big one. Everyone is agreeing here in the beginning that the lender is allowed and authorized to disclose pertinent loan information. Pertinent is a gray area, except if you're using me as a listing agent. Pertinent means anything I need to know to let my seller know if this loan is or is not moving forward. Okay. Now I say that because a lot of times buyer's agents in particularly will get way up in arms. Let's say Scott's a good listing agent. He's listed this property. He's not hearing anything from the buyer's agent. Shocking. So he goes straight to the lender. Buyer's agent says, you can't do that. Actually, the contract specifically says he can. Now, from a protocol standpoint, would it be better for him to reach out to Devin as the buyer's agent and say, hey, I know you're busy. I'm going to touch base with the lender. Just wanted to give you a heads up. Sure. Right. But he's well within his right to check on that. And the lender is well within their right to disclose it. Buyer shall apply for financing by a certain date and then deliver notice of seller reasonable pre-final loan approval. It's a pre-approval letter. It's just whatever it's worth the paper that it's on. Same answer goes to this one, Scott, as the proof of financing. This needs to be within a couple days. If you can apply for the financing within a couple days, I'm nervous about your ability to get that in time to close based on the 30 days we have here. All right, that pre-loan approval contains no unreasonable credit, income, or asset conditions, and they provide that by a certain date. That within a week, you can do that. No repairs required prior to this notice. Final loan approval occurs when lender funds the loan, which normally comes in at a 12 o'clock closing. That fund normally comes in at 11:59. Right, so that final loan approval comes in, and then the contingency is removed a minute later when everybody signs. So just something to keep in mind in that, and this is coming up a lot right now. So just something to keep in mind is that the buyer's pretty protected by the financing contingency unless they've just completely done something wrong. between now and then, they're pretty protected by the financing contingency, which is why it's so important to get an early relationship with the lender. All right. If the buyer changes their lender during the financing period, they must notify the seller in writing within blank calendar days. 2 to 3, not super concerned on that. This is where everybody gets all crazy. Absent written approval by the seller, the buyer cannot change the lender if the closing date agreed upon in paragraph 4 will change as a direct result. That's a redundant statement. If you can't do anything in the contract that changes the closing date unless all parties agree to change the closing date. So where I appreciate that this was put in there, what this does is it makes everyone think that the buyer or the seller has to approve a change in lender. The seller does not have to approve a change in lender. They just have to be put on notice of the change in lender. The only time the seller has to approve is if said change changes the closing date. Okay, big difference there, but you'd be surprised. Buyers agents all or listing agents all get it all the time. Oh my gosh, you wouldn't believe it. Scott told me. I mean, I can't believe it. They changed loan officers. That we didn't agree to that. It's like, okay, well, is the closing date changed? Well, no. Are they approved and moving forward? Well, yes. Okay, well, there's not an issue then, right? It's simply whether or not the closing date changes. If the lender subsequently declines or fails to approve financing, the buyer shall notify the seller and brokers as soon as possible. This is where you can get yourself in trouble. Scott's working with me as the buyer. I finally go to him and say, hey, I got bad news. Turns out I thought I was getting a gift from my parents of $20,000. They can only give me 10. I can't get financing. I can't do anything about it. Scott tries to do everything he can to find a different lender that can get the financing. And next thing you know, a week goes by. That's bad, especially if he can't get financing. So you want to put the seller's note on notice as soon as possible, so you can go tell everyone. And again, if that happens, if I'm Scott, I can go to the listing agent and say, hey, Joseph can't get financing. Here's where we are. We're doing the research on a couple other ones here. We'll keep you posted on it. The seller at that point, if the seller and brokers are notified of inability to obtain financing, then either party don't have to, but may terminate the contract at that point. Make sense? All right, and then the last part here talks about, if who the lender is, it may change if it's FHA, VA, or conventional, and then if the addendums are attached to it. All disclosure at that point. All right, questions so far? All right, let's jump into due diligence. So in June of 2022, we moved, June 13th of 2022 to be exact, we moved to having due diligence as our only option as it relates to inspections and repairs to the South Carolina contract. Now understand that South Carolina contract by default is an as-is contract. When you write a contract in South Carolina, you are defaulting to purchasing the property as is. The added Section 8 gives the buyer the right, privilege, and opportunity to say, hey, I want to have the property inspected and possibly ask you to do any repairs. Okay, so what happens is having the due diligence period takes out as is for that temporary period of time. And then it goes right back to as is. So for the example, we're going to say, what's today? The 24th. Let's just say we have due diligence until February 15th. Due diligence period begins on the effective date and shall expire at 6 p.m. on February 15th. Any extension must be made in writing and agreed to by both parties. I'm going to read through this and then I'm going to go back and just walk through the scenario. During this period, the buyer may take timely, prudent steps to help the buyer, inspector, sellers, estimates, and realtors to all have adequate time for the buyer to coordinate inspections and repair requests, seller to obtain estimates, and buyer and seller to negotiate repairs, and for the buyer to potentially and timely, properly terminate or buy. So what that paragraph is saying is you want to give enough time for the property to be inspected, anything to be addressed, researched, or done by the buyer, and then any requests submitted to the seller, give the seller enough time to then do research to say whether or not they're going to do it, to therefore give the buyer enough time to then say whether or not they're going to terminate the contract or move forward. Any one of those has to be done prior to the due diligence term expiration. During the period, the seller or buyer agree to the following list of 5 items. This is redundant. The only thing I will say is delivering a repair request does not extend the due diligence. So if you're expiring at 6 p.m. on February 15th, and you send a repair request at 5 p.m. on the 15th, the seller then has 1 hour. That's it. Not, oh, now I can respond whenever. If by 1 hour they have to respond, or the buyer has to terminate, otherwise you're moving forward. So during this time frame, here are the 5 things you do: conduct the inspection, deliver any repair requests. After that, you can proceed under the contract and amend it, meaning we've agreed on repairs, we've changed the price, whatever it may be. Proceed under an as-is contract. They're going to buy anyway, even if the seller doesn't agree to change anything, or they're going to terminate the contract. If they terminate the contract, they're going to do so by delivering a notice of termination and highlight, underline, circle, bold, star termination fee to seller within the designated period. During the due diligence, buyer may unilaterally terminate this contract only by delivering to the seller both highlight, circle, bold, underline notice of termination and highlight, circle, bold, underline termination fee of however much. These are ranging anywhere from $100 to $5,000. They're typically not going super high in this market. I will say I was pleasantly surprised at the fact that these did not skyrocket. They were in Raleigh and some of those areas up there, they were $30,000, $40,000 due diligence fees. It's ridiculous. The most important part though is, in order for it to be actually terminated, you have to deliver the notice of termination and the termination fee. So this goes back to what I was saying earlier. The termination fee is in good funds. So that can either be done via a check delivered to the listing agent or the seller, made out to the seller, Venmo, or wire the money to them directly. That goes to the actual seller. If you just deliver the notice of termination, but you didn't deliver the fee, unless the fee is $0, you have not officially terminated the contract. So just keep in mind that early on, you want to establish how that termination fee will be delivered. Evan.
Does the seller have to like sign that, or just once you send it over, it's done?
No, and that's one of the things that it's a great question. The notice of termination is actually a unilateral document. It's a notice. I mean, it flat out says all you got to do is send notice and you're done. Send notice and the fee. It does have space for the seller's signature on there, but the seller does not need to sign it for it to be properly terminated.
How would my buyers, if I have clients at the time, get their earnest money back?
So the earnest money is then handled with the release, the contract release, and that could either be done through the contract release, which is preferable because then everybody's released moving forward. You get full release and you get the earnest money, or a disbursement agreement. I don't particularly love disbursement agreements because I like a release, especially when I represent them. Now, you bring up a good point. Let's go back to the example of February 15th. And let's say on February 10th, everybody knows, hey, we're not moving forward. Okay. We got $5,000 in earnest money and we got $1,000 termination fee. You've got 5 days to make this decision. You can just bypass the notice of termination and the termination fee and send the contract release with $1,000 going to the seller and the other $4,000 coming back to the buyer. If everybody signs off on that, you're released from the contract. Due diligence doesn't matter anymore. You're done. Here's the problem though. That's not a notice of termination, and that is not a delivery of the termination fee. So if you do that on the 10th or 11th, and then you don't have it signed back at 6 p.m. on the 15th, then the buyer has not officially terminated, right? And you move forward as is. So that's only something you'd use if you know you have plenty of time and you get full signature.
Okay.
I know it sounds like splitting hairs, but it's, sometimes that's easier. Sometimes we just had one last week where the listing agent was like, listen, I don't know my guy's Venmo account, and the buyer was at work and he couldn't deliver a check to the listing agent. Honestly, best case scenario on that one is to do digital signatures of the release, and it would take care of everything. However, because that couldn't be done by 6, we had to go meet the buyer, meet them to get a certified check, and then hand deliver that to the seller, because if that not been done or a release signed, then he would have been moving forward as is. Okay.
And the due
All right,
diligence,
so
you're normally putting a couple weeks on due diligence? for the most part?
Yeah, I mean, again, it depends on, a strong buyer's agent. I'd have everything lined up as much as possible. If I can get the inspection done right away and all of that.
Yeah.
Shorter due diligence time, the better. 2 weeks is probably fair.
Okay.
Yep. All right. So the rest of this basically says, if you don't do any of those, the buyer's moving forward as is. Now, that does not remove the CL 100 contingency, the financing contingency, or the appraisal contingency. Those can all still be reasons that the buyers can terminate the contract without having to pay a due diligence fee. If it doesn't appraise, or they don't agree with the CL 100, or they don't get financing. Okay, so we're going to shift into high gear for this last part of the contract. So Section 9, inspection, re-inspection rights. Buyer in South Carolina licensed and insured inspectors. They can basically have the property inspected. They don't have to have the property inspected for due diligence. Keep in mind, due diligence is basically they can terminate for any reason or no reason at all. Okay. Sellers will make the property available. They cannot unreasonably withhold access. Sellers will grant the buyer the right to perform the final walkthrough within 48 hours prior to the closing date. This is very important. A lot of times people will want to do a walkthrough a couple days ahead of time, and they'll say, hey, or they'll do a walkthrough within the 48 hours, but everything's not done, or the house isn't cleaned out yet. This is just the final walkthrough. It does not say that the house needs to be in full show ready condition until closing. So just keep that in mind. Also keep in mind in your repair request document or the repair addendum, you will specify when repairs need to be done, when the walkthrough will be done, and then when the backup time frame is in the event anything else needs to be done that wasn't done before. So that will supersede this 48 hours. So just keep that in mind. The seller can grant permission for the buyer to connect the utilities. That rarely happens. I would not recommend it. Buyer will hold harmless or pay damages to the seller or broker for any claims or injuries that were performed during or happened during these inspections. You may get some real more sophisticated, particularly like lawyers or some high compliance people that may want to strike this paragraph because they don't want to say, well, no, if something's wrong with the house and my inspector gets hurt, I'm not going to hold the seller harmless. If that happens, just let me know. It doesn't happen often, but you might.
Quick question, Joseph. On that 48 hours for the final walkthrough, that is where you will be going through anything, any fixes, anything from an inspection, an inspector report.
Yep.
So that does need to be done within that 48 hours.
Well, it does, but if it can be agreed upon to be done sooner on the repair procedure, or excuse me, the repair addendum. The repair addendum can say it's actually would be done sooner rather than later.
And if it's not done, you typically just
You've trusted. Yep. You've trusted. You've given them the good old college try and be like, I trust that you got it done.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Appraised value. So basically the contract either is or is not contingent on the property appraising. If it does not appraise, one of three things can happen. First one is the seller. Let's say you're under contract for $400,000. It appraises at $375,000. First option is the seller can say, fine, I'll drop the price to $375,000. All other parts of the contract remain the same. If he does do that or she does do that, then the buyer agrees to move forward and they move forward. That's a unilateral decision that can be made. The buyer cannot back out if the seller agrees to lower the price. Now, if the seller comes back and says, I'll lower the price but not pay the same closing costs or won't do the repairs, that's changing the contract. That's not the same thing. Number two, you can renegotiate. You can meet in the middle, come up with a new agreement, new price, or three, the buyer can terminate the contract at that point without penalty. So they would not be paying a termination fee or anything like that. That's outside of due diligence. Even if it happens within the due diligence timeframe. We've got some confusion on that right now. You've got 2 weeks of due diligence, and for whatever reason, the appraisal was done within that 2 weeks, and they come back and say, hey, it didn't appraise, I want out. That's separate from due diligence. They would not be required to pay the termination fee. It's a separate contingency. All right. 11, the wood infestation report. So this works basically this way. Basically says the home will be inspected. Either is or is not on the home being inspected for wood infest or for basically a C100 report. Who's going to pay for it? Who's going to select the inspector? And therefore, who's going to deliver the notice? Wood infestation reports cannot be any sooner or earlier than 30 calendar days prior to the closing, and then no later to blank calendar days prior to closing. I wouldn't make this some big number. I would say 5 to 10 days is fine. The bigger the number you make, the more likely it is to miss the deadline. You've got a 30-day closing and you've got 15 calendar days prior to closing to deliver this information and you forget. On day 14, the buyers agreed to purchase the property without this. In the event that anything is revealed in this, one of three things happens. Seller agrees to address it. If the seller agrees to address it, buyer has to move forward, regardless of the extent of the damage. If it comes back and says, hey, the house is falling down with termites, the seller comes back and says, totally fine, I'll rebuild the entire house. Buyer has to move forward. Okay. Or seller says, I'm not fixing it. Then the buyer at that point can say, cool, I'm not buying it. Or then thirdly, you can renegotiate to have either, remove this and still move forward as is, or some sort of renegotiation at that point. Questions?
Yeah. So let's say the seller agrees to remedy it, but it's a pretty intense infestation, so it's going to take some time. Therefore, it goes outside all of the deadlines we've set on this contract. As the buyer, I'm still required to buy that property though, even though it's not,
So that's
goes outside all these timelines we've set.
Yeah, so the timeline that this would be in would be really the closing. So the seller would have to agree whether or not they can remedy those deficiencies within the closing timeframe. So if it's so intense they can't do it by closing, the buyer is not required to then extend the closing. And the buyer could then argue at that point in time, hey, you didn't have a house that could have been closed in that time, so you didn't negotiate in good faith.
Okay.
What really comes up in those situations, you have a really big and this is something that, if you're familiar, and Scott, you'll run into this with your background too, is where you run into some challenges is you'll see some major damages or some major issues. And the seller's like, I'll take care of it. And then the buyer's like, will you though? Are you really going to take care of it I know from my background, or I know from whatever, that this quality is going to be hard to match. And then you get into this whole, because all it really says is it says, seller shall furnish the buyer with a CO 100 wood infestation report by a qualified licensed bonded pest control operator, stating that the property is free from any infestation or damages herein mentioned. So really what then has to happen is Scott has to go hire this contractor to go do all the giant work. And then we have to have the CO 100 come back in and say, yes, work's been done and everything's fine. All right, now we get bunch of disclosures. Section 12, survey title, elevation insurance. We recommend that we have all that done. Have it surveyed, have elevation checked, have all your insurance done, get all that on there. And by the way, we're not the people to do that. We're going to put you in touch with the surveyors, the insurance people, everything there. That's not our profession. Survival, any provision of the contract is required to be observed, kept, or performed after closing. It will survive the closing and remain binding for the parties until fully observed, kept, or performed. So where this comes up, or any repairs not done prior to closing, I don't care how clear this paragraph is, you lose all leverage when you close as a buyer. So if repairs aren't done, I'm going to say as the buyer, I'm not closing. I might agree to extend if you're going to make sure you guarantee you're going to do it, but if you don't fix by the time of closing, I'm not going to move on from it. So the survival paragraph, just where it does protect the buyer a little bit, you do lose a lot of leverage once you close. Section 14, this talks about the home warranty, whether or not there will be one, who's going to provide it, what company it will be, and then how much it will be, and then a disclosure, who's going to pay for it, and then a disclosure of the fact that you as the agent may receive some sort of administrative fee for selling the home warranty. Fire or casualty or injury. This basically says if something happens to the property, either through some sort of fire or any sort of act of God, one of three things can happen. Number one, if it's damaged, the buyer and the seller can agree to transfer all insurance proceeds to the buyer. The buyer can move forward, take that with them, and then fix the property. Number two, the seller can agree to fix the property, have it done prior to closing. Or number three, the buyer can say, can decide whether or not they want to take the property as it is or cancel the contract. Section 16. This is basically saying that the buyer and seller agree that the seller's disclosure has been delivered prior to the contract, which it should be. There will not be, Maybe 1% of the time are you really going to ever be involved in a transaction that does not require a property disclosure. There are very few exceptions to this, particularly with the type, of real estate that we do. We don't do a lot of estate sales or anything like that, or transfers for that. So this should be agreed upon. They should have provided ahead of time. If they did not provide it ahead of time, it is your buyer's obligation or right, I shouldn't say obligation, it's their right and privilege to ask an attorney whether or not they should move forward without having a property disclosure. Totally up to them. That being said, even if they fill out the property disclosure, they're going to have the property inspected. It's hard to really rely on that anyway. And one could argue that one of the upcoming paragraphs completely negates the strength of a property disclosure. Paragraph 17, section 17 says if the house was built prior to 1978, you will have to fill out forms saying don't eat the paint, because it could have some lead-based paint in there. Section 18, any sort of information that the buyer or the seller is looking for as it relates to sex offenders, any criminal information, that is up to the buyer or seller to obtain that information, not up to you or the listing agent, or vice versa. Section 19 talks about whether or not the buyer is okay with the broker holding their earnest money in an interest-bearing account. I don't know of an escrow agent or an attorney locally that has an interest-bearing account. So I would always default to may not in here. This really only shows up with your high net worth clients. If you've got a high net worth client that's putting down a substantial amount for earnest money, they may not be super keen on someone holding that amount of money and collecting interest on it versus them having it. Again, I've never really seen this come up as an issue. Section 20 says if you're a non-resident, you will have to participate in the non-resident income tax gain, which means that the attorney may withhold money at closing based on that. So if they are a non-resident, as part of your listing presentation or consultation, you're going to want to put them in touch with the attorney for that. Section 21, this is the small one that gets us on a lot of things. Entire and binding agreement, merger clause. Basically, what this means is that this contract expresses the entire agreement between the parties. There are no other agreements, oral or otherwise, modifying the terms, and this contract is binding on all parties and principals, heirs, personal representatives, successors, and assigns. What this means is, the example I gave earlier, Scott agreed to pay $15,000 in closing costs. I can only get 10. So Scott and I run into each other at a bar, and I'm say, "Hey, will you just leave me $5 grand of cash in the kitchen counter or kitchen cabinet?" And he says, "Sure." Can't do that. Hey, we've got an addendum that goes on here that says I'm going to pay directly a contractor to do some repairs, but we don't want the lender to see it. Can't do that. Those sorts of agreements. Hey, I'm going to pay your son, right? Because I had the extra 5,000. That's what this says, is there's no agreement outside of the contract and everything that's disclosed on the settlement statement.
Question. What about in the case of selling a furnished property, and so you have a bill of sale that has to be separate because most financiers won't put that, like won't let you finance furnishing? How does that work in addition to this then?
Right. So that would be, great question. It still can be referenced, right? So it can be referenced as a bill of sale, as was said on page 1. So it would have to be referenced. If the lender comes back and says, no, you can't have it, or if you have a bill of sale, it has to have a value of 0. Now, after that, if they're truly saying, hey, we can't have that either, I'll have to double check. But at that point, that's a transaction of personal property. That's not a transaction of, if they're purchasing the property outside of this, that's an agreement that's outside of the real property.
Gotcha. So it doesn't fall under this an illegal provision, because it's kind of like me buying something off Facebook Marketplace of all your furniture from your house or something. It's not a real estate transaction at the end of the day. Okay, cool.
Correct. Paragraph 22 basically says any adjustments that will be made. So if you have any utilities, HOA, taxes, any fees that are paid that need to be adjusted, they will be adjusted to the day of closing, and the day of closing belongs to the seller. So the seller owns the house on the day of closing, so all the prorations will be done through the end of that day. Paragraph 23 is the paragraph you turn them to should they want to default on the contract. So Evan comes to me and says, hey, love everything about it, but I found this house down the street, so I'm okay just giving up my earnest money and moving on to that. It's not just an earnest money game. Evan's defaulting on the contract at that point. So he could have the risk of his earnest money. The seller, and these are all the things that the other party could do by defaulting. Again, this isn't to scare anyone, yet this happens all the time. Because the buyer's like, you know what? I don't care. We just had this last week. We had, it was a lot, $12,000 earnest money. Buyer purchased the house in Dunes West, was sight unseen, had inspections, everything was fine. She came for the final walkthrough the day before the closing and hated the house, absolutely hated the house. And basically was like, I don't want it. And I know I've got earnest money on the line, and that's fine. They can have the earnest money. The challenge is, it's not just about the earnest money. She's now defaulted in the contract. She could be responsible for any damages to the buyer, or excuse me, the seller. Could be responsible for commission. She could be responsible for a lot of things on there. So just keep in mind that happens. Now, in this situation, we were lucky in that the seller was fine. They just released the contract, took their earnest money, and put it back on the market. They could have pushed back. So that's just, and in that case, you're not an attorney. So you have to balance this fine line. If I come to you, Evan, as the buyer and say, hey, I want out, you can't say, well, we'll get sued. That's not good. Don't say that. Just say, okay, here's what I need to do. I got to point you to this right here. As I see it, you may be in default of the contract. Here are some of the things that could happen. And let's get the attorney on the phone and find out what's going on. Okay. All right, mediation. To potentially avoid lengthy litigation, they encourage the parties to mediate in the event that there is some sort of dispute. This typically comes with earnest money and a default at that point. I will tell you, we've had numerous, uncountable, an immeasurable amount of disputes. I can count on one hand how many that have actually gone to mediation, meaning we've worked the majority of them out, broker to broker, or they just go straight to that point to litigation. It's rare that they go straight to litigation, though. Non-reliance clause. This is where you could argue that the disclosure and anything outside of the contract doesn't matter anymore. The non-reliance clause basically says that the parties have executed this contract without reliance on any statements, representation, inducements, promises, or agreements by brokers or parties except as expressly stipulated set forth in this contract. Basically, it's saying, look, you've signed this, and by signing this, it's buyer beware. So you need to go and do all your inspections, have your attorney review all of this, have everything look at this, and make sure this is still the house you want to buy. Broker disclaimer basically says we're here for real estate advice and values as it relates to the market, what's going on, facilitating a transaction. We are not inspectors, lawyers, lenders, surveyors, anything like that. So if you have any questions on those specific areas, you need to bring in those experts. Broker's compensation will be paid at closing by the attorney. Section 28 basically states this is where any attachments or other agreements are. So you would want to reference this agreement, any addendums, bills of sale, anything that you have that attaches to this, you would reference here in section 28. Notice and delivery, unilateral communication from one party to the other. Notice from a buyer representing a party is deemed notice to and from a party. All notice, consents, approvals, and similar actions required under this contract must be in paper or electronic writing and will only be effective as the delivery of the notice, the address, email, fax written below. So basically what this says is that notice can be, let's just use a situation. I represent Scott as the seller and Amy represents Evan as the buyer. That notice can be between Amy and me as the representatives. And it needs to be done through the address, email, or fax for those of you that fax. To the numbers that are disclosed at the end of the contract. Paragraph 30 is in bold. It says, hey, we're in a litigious society. So any wiring instructions, you need to make sure you verify before you do it. And then you also need to be disclosed that while you're in a property, that it may be surveilled, either based on South Carolina law. So be careful what you say. Parties acknowledge that they've reviewed all the documents in this contract, any disclosures or anything there. If you have any further questions, you would want to consult an attorney. Offer expires at this time. Once it's expired, the parties do not have to respond. If they don't, or if they do respond, they have to have it closed off and reinitialed. And if there is no expiration here, it will automatically expire in 30 days. Signed, sealed, delivered. Look at there, 3 minutes to spare. All right, questions?
Great refresher, no question.
Well, that's good.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Of course. So here's what I would suggest. Go fill one out. Go pick a house. Go pick, I think I just saw one. Kristen and I were playing on the MLS earlier. I think there's a $4.9 million house just came on the market on Sullivan's. Go write an offer on it. Send it to me and say, hey, what'd I miss? I'll review it and say, here's what you missed. And here's what could go wrong if someone signed that as is. Do that. Happy to review it. Again, get comfortable with it and also get comfortable with turning to it. I will tell you that if any of you follow up with me and if you have a contract question, 9 times out of 10, I will pull a copy of it out of my bag, or I'll go to my computer and go to that section just to reread it to make sure. Just treat it as a living document.
I did
Awesome.
learn,
Thank you.
All right.
I did learn something new. I was taught something slightly different on the date when it comes to, I forgot what section it is, but it's pertaining to the pre-approval of the loan, like the mortgage section. I was
Mhm.
told to just put a space and type in pre-approve. I never really put in a date. Like, I figured if I'm submitting a contract, like submitting an offer, that person's already pre-approved. So I didn't know that, hey, they could potentially not already be pre-approved, but we're going to give them a day or two to have that together. I didn't even know we could do that.
Yeah, that was a change. I think the change that was made in 2021, I think they changed the financing paragraph a little bit. And a lot of people just, again, in my opinion, they moved a little backwards on this as it relates to pre-approval versus
Qualified.
qualified. Thank you. But I get it. At the end of the day, the buyer's only got so much control over what the lender's telling them.
Mhm.
So, a buyer could be like, sure, I was told this. And then all of a sudden the lender comes back and then, the buyer's like, well, this guy told me and told me I was fine. And all of a sudden I'm not, and I'm in default. So I think it just frees up the buyer a little bit.
And then also my other look at me. I said I didn't have it. Well, I
Look
have
at it. Love it.
I definitely learned to be very specific in this section as far as the appliances and everything like that. Like I learned to copy and paste from the MLS, and no, that's a big no. And that's part of it, it's my fault because I left off the refrigerator, but I did that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so now, since you're saying, hey, that section needs to be very specific, I mean, that makes sense, right? Because if someone,
Yeah.
I say refrigerator, and then you go put a janky refrigerator in there, then I wasn't specific. So that made me like, okay, I now know how important that section is.
That's awesome. Yeah, and it happens all the time. And then we'll get this, and I'll get this from buyer's agent. They'll say, well, it said it in the MLS. Okay, well, it also said 400 in the MLS, and you ratified for 350. So the seller can't come back and say, okay, fine, I'll give you the fridge because it said in the MLS, but the MLS also said 400, so pay me 400. So it's the same thing. It's an extreme example, but it's literally only marketing.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And then also that home was a newer home. It was built in 2020. So of course, a new home is not going to have a refrigerator there. So it's not a good best practice to copy from the MLS. So that was something else that I learned.
Yep. So that reminds me, and we'll close on this one unless you guys have any other questions, is don't ever use the word new when you're marketing a property, unless it's a brand new property. New windows, new appliances, any of those, I've seen it. I've seen our listing agent and the listing company wrote a big old check to buy new windows, new appliances and everything. And they were a year old. That to me is new. So anyway, that's your fun fact for the day. All right. If you guys have any questions, let me know. Thank you so much for bearing with me.
What if you put that in there, new 2018 or 2018? Then you're
fine.
covered.
Yep. Yeah.
Got it. Thank you, Joseph.
All right, guys.
Thank
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.